He told her, "I love someone else," knowing she was pregnant with his child. 2 years later, he saw her again, holding hands with their identical triplet daughters. The office was quiet, too quiet for a building that ruled over a billion-dollar empire. Olivia Hart stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city blur beneath her. She could see her reflection in the glass, soft blonde hair cascading down her shoulders, hands trembling slightly as they rested on her abdomen. Her sky-blue eyes were filled with something between fear and fragile hope. Behind her, Nicholas Blake stood like a sculpture of himself, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, dark hair neatly styled, those same piercing blue eyes that once looked at her as if she were his entire world. Now they were cold, distant, as though looking past her. "I love someone else," he said, the words slicing through the air with brutal precision. His voice was calm, rehearsed, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Olivia turned slowly, as if movement itself was painful. She searched his face, desperate to find a crack in the mask, a sign that he was lying to her, to himself. But there was nothing. Only a void. "You know I'm pregnant, Nicholas." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of those words seemed to pull the walls closer. "I know," he said, his eyes briefly flickering to her stomach, where their unborn child was growing. "That's why it has to be like this." It was surreal. The man who had once whispered promises into her ear, who had held her as if she were breakable and sacred, now stood in front of her like a stranger. Olivia's lips parted, but no words came. What was there to say? Begging was beneath her. Anger would only make her shatter. So she stood there, breathing, fighting the urge to collapse. Her heart screamed, but her face remained still. "I hope she's worth it," Olivia said finally, the only defense she had left. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to the end. Nicholas didn't follow her. He didn't say a word. The doors slid shut, closing off the man she thought she knew. As the elevator descended, Olivia placed a hand on her belly, feeling a soft flutter from within. A tear rolled down her cheek, but her chin was held high. This was no longer about Nicholas Blake. This was about survival. About 3 tiny heartbeats she had promised to protect, even if their father had chosen to forget them. The city was loud when she stepped outside. It didn't care about broken hearts or betrayals. That day, Olivia Hart vowed to never look back. The apartment was small, barely enough space for one person, let alone a woman carrying triplets. The walls were thin, the heater groaned in protest every night, and the cracked window let in the bitter wind no matter how tightly she tried to seal it. Olivia had lived in luxury before, in penthouses where the floor gleamed and the city lights seemed like distant stars at her feet. Now, she lived paycheck to paycheck, each dollar stretched until it nearly tore. She sat at the kitchen table, which was really just an old desk she'd dragged in from a thrift store. The sewing machine in front of her hummed late into the night, its rhythm the only music in the hollow apartment. Fabric scraps lay scattered across the floor. She had taken up sewing children's dresses, custom orders through an online shop. It didn't pay much, but it was honest work, and it allowed her to stay home, close to her growing belly. Every stitch felt like an act of defiance, like she was threading strength into herself with every pass of the needle. The pregnancy was hard. Much harder than the doctors had warned. From the very first ultrasound, when the technician's eyes widened in surprise and the word "triplets" was whispered with a mixture of awe and concern, Olivia knew this was not going to be an ordinary journey. She remembered sitting in the sterile white office, hearing the risks spelled out in clinical, detached voices: preterm labor, underweight infants, the strain on her heart and body. There was even a moment, a cold suggestion from a specialist, that she could reduce the pregnancy, to choose one child to keep, to improve the odds for survival. Olivia had left that office without saying a word, but her silence was her decision. all three or none at all. Nights were the worst. Sleep was elusive, chased away by discomfort and the endless loop of thoughts that played in her mind. She would lie awake, one hand resting over her stomach, feeling the soft movements, sometimes a kick, sometimes a flutter that felt like tiny wings brushing against her from the inside. In those quiet hours, when exhaustion and loneliness threatened to swallow her, it was the thought of those three little lives that kept her afloat. They were hers. They were real. She had no family to turn to. Her mother had passed away years ago, and her father was a distant memory of someone who had never cared to stay. Friends had slowly vanished after the scandal with Nicholas. In their world, loyalty shifted with wealth and reputation. Pregnant and alone didn't fit into their social calendars. One evening, as a cold rain tapped against the window, Olivia found herself sitting on the floor, surrounded by tiny dresses she had just finished sewing. She gently picked up a sky blue one, holding it against her belly. She imagined a little girl wearing it, dark hair, bright blue eyes, giggling as she spun in circles. Then another in pink. Another in soft lavender. Her vision blurred with tears, but this time they weren't from despair. It was love. Fierce, overwhelming love that burned through every wound Nicholas had left. Her body ached more with each passing week. Simple tasks became mountains. There were days when standing up felt like lifting the weight of the world. But she refused to stop working. Every dollar mattered. Every dress she sewed was food on the table, rent for another week, or a warm blanket for her babies. People admired her designs, sent her messages praising the delicate craftsmanship, but none of them knew the real story. None of them knew that the woman sewing those dresses often cried over them in the dead of night, whispering promises to the children yet to be born. The day she went into labor came earlier than expected. Olivia had been dreading it, knowing the risks, knowing how fragile everything was. The contraction started while she was finishing an order, and within hours, she was in a hospital bed, under the blinding white lights, doctors murmuring in clipped, urgent tones. It was chaos and fear, yet through it all, Olivia stayed calm. She had made peace with the possibility of loss, but somewhere deep inside, she also believed in miracles. When the cries filled the delivery room, first one, then another, then a third, Olivia couldn't hold back the sobs. They were small, heartbreakingly small, but alive. Sky, Sophie, Sadie. The nurses placed them briefly against her chest before whisking them away to the neonatal unit. Olivia's heart shattered and healed in the same breath. Days in the hospital blurred into one another. She sat by their incubators, watching their tiny chests rise and fall, tubes and wires attached to their impossibly small bodies. She whispered stories to them, told them how brave they were, how proud she was of each little breath they took. The doctors were amazed at how strong the girls were. Against all odds, they were fighters, just like their mother. When she was finally allowed to bring them home, Olivia stood at the doorway of her apartment, holding the car seats with trembling hands. The space looked even smaller now, but it didn't matter. She placed them gently in a line, looking at the three faces that mirrored their father's features but belonged to her entirely. "I'll protect you," she whispered. "Even if it kills me." And in that tiny apartment, surrounded by worn-out furniture and the soft coos of her daughters, Olivia Hart became the strongest woman in the world. The city was alive that afternoon, bathed in the soft light of early spring. Streets bustled with people, the chatter of conversations blending with the distant hum of traffic. Nicholas Blake walked along the crowded sidewalk, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat, his head bowed as though the weight of his thoughts had become too heavy to bear. His once pristine life had unraveled thread by thread over the past 2 years. The boardrooms no longer welcomed him with the same reverence, his last name had become a point of quiet scandal whispered in glass corridors. But that wasn't what haunted him. It was her face. Olivia's face. He had seen her in his dreams, her voice echoing in the hollow spaces of his penthouse. He would wake to silence, sometimes half convinced that the curve of her smile had only been imagined. But every time, it was real. More real than anything he had left. He didn't know why he took that route that day. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps some invisible thread was pulling him, drawing him toward the collision course he had been avoiding. As he rounded the corner into the park, the world seemed to pause. There, amidst the trees that were just beginning to show their first green buds, a woman stood by a bench, adjusting the straps of a stroller. Her hair caught the light, a soft halo of blonde that made his breath catch. His steps faltered, slowing until he stopped completely. The city faded into a blur around him. Olivia. But it wasn't just her. The stroller wasn't for one child. There were 3 small seats, and in them sat 3 little girls, identical in their perfection. Dark hair peeked out from under pastel hats, and when one of them turned her head, Nicholas saw it, the same shade of piercing blue that greeted him every morning in the mirror. For a moment, he couldn't move. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a deafening drum. It was surreal, like watching his own life unfold in front of him from the outside. They were real. Flesh and blood. His daughters. Olivia noticed him then. Their eyes locked across the distance, and Nicholas felt the sharp sting of her gaze. There was no hatred in her expression, no drama, no accusatory gesture. What he saw was worse. She looked at him as if he was no one. A stranger. A passerby. As though every memory they had shared was buried under the rubble of his betrayal. She bent down, unhurried, lifting one of the girls into her arms, cradling her close as she adjusted the other 2 in the stroller. It was an act of simple motherhood, but to Nicholas, it was like watching an entire lifetime he had forfeited. He could see the small gestures, the way Olivia's fingers gently brushed the child's cheek, the softness in her eyes that had once been reserved for him. He took a step forward. Then another. His mouth opened, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry? That he had made a mistake? Those words felt grotesque, empty, unworthy of the woman standing before him who had raised 3 daughters in a world that had turned its back on her. Olivia's expression remained calm, but her grip on the child in her arms tightened ever so slightly. She was shielding them. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. She was a mother now, and Nicholas realized in that moment that he no longer had any claim to her. Or to them. Still, his body moved of its own accord, driven by the desperate ache inside him. "Olivia," he said, but his voice was hoarse, barely audible against the noise of the park. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her back to him, adjusting the stroller straps with methodical precision. One of the girls let out a soft giggle, unaware of the storm lingering in the air. Nicholas felt the distance stretch between them, wider than the few steps that separated their bodies. He stood frozen, watching as Olivia pushed the stroller forward, her pace steady, unhurried, as though he had never existed. He followed, though he kept his distance. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was punishment. Perhaps it was hope. He watched them as they moved through the park, Olivia occasionally stopping to fix a fallen toy or to kiss a tiny forehead, the girls babbling in a language only they understood. Each movement was a small miracle, a world he had never been invited into. But Nicholas could see it now, clearer than ever. He hadn't just lost Olivia. He had lost years. First words, first steps, the quiet moments of wonder that belonged to the early years of a child's life. He had been absent, not because he had been pushed away, but because he had chosen to walk out of that hospital room 2 years ago, too afraid of the consequences. As Olivia reached the park gate, she paused. For a fleeting second, Nicholas thought she might turn back. That perhaps some piece of their shared past would flicker in her expression. But she didn't. She adjusted the sun hat on one of the girls, whispered something that made the child giggle, and stepped out onto the bustling street. Nicholas stood there long after they were gone, the wind tugging at his coat, the sounds of the city washing over him like a distant echo. His heart was no longer broken. It was empty. Hollowed out by the sight of 3 tiny girls who didn't even know his name. But as he stood there, watching the space where they had been, a quiet resolve began to take shape. This wasn't over. Not for him. He had lost 2 years. He wouldn't lose a lifetime. He turned and began walking, not back to his office, not back to his penthouse, but toward the only future that mattered. A future where he would have to fight, not for his reputation, not for his fortune, but for the right to stand beside the woman he had once loved and the daughters who had no idea their father had just seen them for the first time. The battle for forgiveness had just begun. The address hadn't changed. Nicholas found it scribbled in a notebook that had somehow survived the chaos of his life, an address he had never dared to use until now. It was a modest building tucked between a laundromat and a corner store, far from the sleek glass towers and private elevators he was used to. He stood outside the door, staring at the worn brass numbers as though they were some ancient code he had to decipher. His hand hovered over the doorbell, the weight of everything he had lost pressing against his chest. When he finally pressed it, the sound echoed, sharp and invasive, breaking the fragile air around him. Minutes passed. He wasn't sure if she would answer. He wouldn't have blamed her if she didn't. But then the door opened, and there she was. Olivia stood in the doorway, no makeup, hair pulled back into a loose knot, dressed in simple jeans and a soft sweater that clung to her in a way that was far more beautiful than any designer gown. She looked at him with the same calm indifference he had seen in the park, but now, up close, he could see the quiet exhaustion in her eyes, the shadows of sleepless nights, the weight of a woman who had carried too much for too long. Nicholas opened his mouth to speak, but Olivia's hand raised slightly, stopping him before a single word could escape. "What do you want, Nicholas?" Her voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was factual, as though she were asking him to name his purpose and leave. "I need to see them," he said, his voice rough, barely holding itself together. "I need to see my daughters." For a moment, she didn't move. The silence between them was dense, as though the walls had shifted closer. Finally, Olivia sighed, not in defeat, but in resignation, as though she had known this moment would come eventually. She stepped aside, wordlessly allowing him into the apartment. The inside was exactly what he had feared and yet more than he could have imagined. It was small, yes, but it was warm. Toys were scattered across the floor, handmade dresses hung neatly on a line, and tiny shoes were lined up by the door. It was not a place of wealth, but it was rich with life, with care, with love. The air smelled faintly of lavender and baby powder, a scent that hit him harder than any confrontation could have. "They're asleep," Olivia said, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the doorway to what he assumed was their shared bedroom. "They nap after lunch. You have 10 minutes, Nicholas." He wasn't sure if she meant 10 minutes to speak or 10 minutes to prove himself, but either way, he took it. He stepped into the living room, careful not to disturb the delicate order of the chaos. He noticed a small photo on the shelf, Olivia holding the 3 girls in her arms, her smile soft and tired, but genuine. He had never seen her look more alive. And it tore him apart. "I didn't come here to beg for forgiveness," he started, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I know I don't deserve it. But I need you to understand something. That day, when I said I loved someone else, it was a lie. A coward's lie. My family, my board, put a gun to my head, Olivia. They told me if I didn't walk away from you, I'd lose everything. And I didn't have the courage to fight them. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I disappeared, at least you wouldn't get dragged into their war." Olivia didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. She stood still, absorbing his words with the same calm she had worn since the moment he arrived. He continued, the words pouring out of him now, the dam finally broken. I didn't know about the triplets until after you left. I came back to the office, and they told me you had resigned, disappeared. I tried to find you. God, I tried. But my father, he made sure every door was locked. They wanted me to marry someone from their circle, to tie me to their business empire, and he paused, swallowing the bitter taste of his own failure. I let them win. I let fear dictate my choices. He ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping. But after that day, I couldn't live with myself. I severed ties. Sold off my shares. I'm not the CEO anymore, Olivia. I'm not the man who chose power over you. I'm just a man who's been walking around empty for 2 years. There was a long, suffocating pause. Olivia's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition in her expression, but then her arms folded tighter, as though she needed to brace herself. You think saying that changes anything? She asked, her voice quiet, but it carried an edge. You think because you finally woke up, I'm supposed to just hand you back the life you walked away from? Do you have any idea what it's like, Nicholas? To carry 3 lives inside you while the father of those children vanishes into thin air? To sew clothes at 3 in the morning because that's the only time you have left after changing diapers and rocking crying babies to sleep? You were gone. You don't get to come back and pretend that a monologue fixes that. Nicholas felt the sting of every word. She was right. Of course, she was right. But this wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about fighting for the chance to be worthy of standing in the same room as the pieces. I don't expect forgiveness, Olivia, he said, taking a step closer, though not enough to invade the fragile boundary she had set. But I'm not going to disappear again. I'll be here, even if it's just as a shadow in their lives. I will earn my place, not because I want it, but because they deserve a father who never gives up. A soft sound interrupted them. It was faint, but unmistakable, the groggy murmur of a child waking from a nap. Olivia's head turned slightly toward the bedroom door, instinct overtaking her posture. For the first time since he had arrived, Nicholas saw her armor crack. The mother in her was always alert, always ready. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable now. You're not getting any closer to them until I decide you're safe, she said, her voice clipped, but not cruel. Not safe for me. Safe for them. Nicholas nodded. It was more than he had hoped for. He wasn't looking for a shortcut back into their lives. He was ready to take the long road, however brutal it would be. As Olivia disappeared into the bedroom to tend to the girls, Nicholas stood alone in the small living room, his heart pounding with something new. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was a beginning. A first breath in a life he had nearly destroyed. He turned toward the small window, the city stretching out beyond the glass. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't look so empty. The days after his visit passed slowly, as if time itself had thickened around Nicholas, forcing him to wade through every moment with the weight of his choices pressing against him. Olivia didn't call, didn't send a message, but she hadn't slammed the door in his face either. That was more than he deserved, and he knew it. Yet the thought of his daughters growing up without knowing him was unbearable. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future, even if it meant starting at the very bottom of their lives. Nicholas began showing up at the park where Olivia took the girls for their morning walks. He kept his distance at first, sitting on a bench beneath a tree, pretending to read a newspaper while his eyes were fixed on them. He watched Olivia gently lift each girl into the swings, her hands careful, yet practiced, as if she could do it in her sleep. The girls, Sky, Sophie, and Sadie, were tiny whirlwinds of curiosity, their dark curls bouncing as they toddled around with the chaotic coordination of toddlers learning their world. He memorized every sound of their laughter, every tilt of their heads, and every moment Olivia's hand reached out instinctively to guide or protect them. At first, Olivia ignored his presence. She would glance toward him, offer no acknowledgement, and return her full attention to the girls. But he noticed how she never left the park while he was there. She allowed him to stay within sight, as though silently testing him to see if his determination would wither. One morning, when the spring air was soft and the park less crowded, one of the girls, Sophie, he later learned, wandered closer to his bench. Her tiny legs moved with the determination only a 2-year-old could possess. She stood before him, staring with wide blue eyes that mirrored his own. Nicholas froze, afraid that the smallest wrong move would shatter this fragile moment. He offered a hesitant smile, lowering the newspaper to his lap, his hands open and non-threatening. Sophie tilted her head, studying him with innocent curiosity. Olivia was there within seconds, kneeling beside her daughter, her expression unreadable. She didn't scold the child, didn't yank her away. Instead, she simply looked at Nicholas, her gaze sharp, measuring. Without saying a word, she lifted Sophie into her arms and carried her back to the stroller, but something had shifted. She hadn't built a wall between them. Not this time. The next day, Nicholas came prepared. He carried a small paper bag with slices of fresh fruit, the kind toddlers loved. He didn't approach them directly. Instead, when Olivia settled on a bench to read while the girls played within arm's reach, Nicholas quietly placed the bag on the bench's far end and walked away. Olivia noticed. She didn't touch it at first, but when one of the girls began fussing, she reached into the bag, pulled out a slice of apple, and offered it to her daughter. She never looked up at Nicholas, but he saw her fingers tremble slightly. These small, wordless interactions became their new language. Nicholas never intruded, never crossed the invisible line Olivia had drawn. He would sit nearby, sometimes reading, sometimes silently watching, and offer small gestures. A toy he had noticed was missing a piece, a small blanket when the wind picked up. Slowly, Olivia's stance began to soften. One afternoon, a stroller wheel jammed as Olivia tried to maneuver it over a patch of uneven pavement. Nicholas was beside her before she could even glance up, kneeling down to fix the wheel with a quiet efficiency that surprised even himself. He didn't speak, neither did she. But when the wheel clicked back into place, Olivia exhaled, a quiet, involuntary sigh that carried more weight than words. For the first time, she didn't immediately retreat after accepting his help. The girls began to recognize him too. They would point in his direction, babbling incoherent phrases, their faces lighting up with smiles when they saw him approach from afar. He never allowed himself the indulgence of lifting them into his arms or kneeling to their level without Olivia's silent approval, but each glance, each small smile from the children was a battle won. Weeks turned into months. Nicholas became a part of their routine, not as a father, not yet, but as a constant presence. He learned their favorite songs, the rhythm of their afternoon moods, the way Sophie furrowed her brows when concentrating, how Sadie always claimed the left side of the stroller, and how Skye would reach out her hand for balance whenever she toddled over uneven ground. He also learned Olivia's silences, how to read the subtle shifts in her posture, when to stay back and when to offer a quiet act of assistance. One rainy afternoon, the park was nearly empty. Olivia struggled with an umbrella as she tried to shield the girls while adjusting the stubborn stroller cover. Nicholas approached without asking. This time, she didn't stop him. He held the umbrella steady over her as she secured the cover, their hands brushing only once, but the touch sent a quiet shiver through him. When Olivia finished, she looked up at him, and for the first time, her eyes softened, not with resignation, but with tired gratitude. "You're persistent," she said, her tone neutral, but there was no coldness in it. It was the first sentence she had spoken to him since that day at the apartment. "I can't afford not to be," Nicholas replied, his voice steady, though his heart pounded with the significance of her words. The girls giggled under the stroller cover, oblivious to the delicate truce forming above them. Olivia's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't far from it either. Nicholas didn't need to win her over with grand gestures or hollow apologies. It was the small things, the daily, patient acts of being there. Every buttoned-up business instinct he once prided himself on had no place here. This was not a boardroom negotiation. This was a slow, relentless climb, step by step, into the life of a woman who had every reason to shut him out. And yet, she was letting him in, an inch at a time. The morning paper arrived earlier than usual. Nicholas sat at his kitchen table, staring at the front page where his own face stared back at him under the headline, "BILLIONAIRE rebuilds his empire in the shadows." It was a scathing article, filled with half-truths and thinly veiled threats, crafted by the very people who once applauded his rise. His former business partners, the board members who had pressured him into sacrificing Olivia, were now painting him as a liability, a man who had turned his back on the family legacy for a woman they considered beneath their circle. The article didn't mention Olivia or the girls directly, but the insinuations were clear. They had found out that he was spending time with them again. And they wanted it to stop. The phone call came later that afternoon. He recognized the number immediately. Jonathan Pierce, one of the senior board members who had once acted like a second father to him, now spoke with the cold precision of a man issuing an ultimatum. "Nicholas, we need to talk about these appearances you've been making in public parks. The company's image is not something we can allow you to tarnish further. You need to decide what matters more, some woman and her children, or the empire your father built." Nicholas had heard these words before, dressed in different tones, laced with softer threats. But this time, they didn't shake him. This time, the image of Olivia lifting Sadie into her arms after a stumble, of Sophie's infectious laughter, of Sky's small hand reaching for his, stood clearer in his mind than any boardroom chart or stock price. "I already made that choice 2 years ago," Nicholas replied, his voice calm, though every word was laced with steel. "And I chose wrong. I won't make that mistake again." He hung up before Jonathan could respond. But he knew this was only the beginning. The threats would escalate. His former allies had too much pride, too much invested in their image to let his defiance go unanswered. And this time, they wouldn't settle for veiled articles and hushed warnings. They would come for Olivia, not directly, but through the ruthless whispers that could ruin reputations, destroy her small business, and paint her as a scandalous opportunist. He couldn't let that happen. Nicholas arrived at Olivia's apartment late that evening, unannounced. He didn't expect a warm welcome, but she let him in without a word. The girls were asleep, their tiny breaths filling the small bedroom with a peaceful rhythm that contrasted sharply with the storm that was brewing outside. "They're going to come after you," Nicholas said as soon as the door closed behind him. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't offer the courtesy of softening the truth. "The people I used to work with. They found out about the girls. About you. They'll twist the story. They'll try to make it look like you trapped me, like you're the reason I left the company. It's not about me anymore, Olivia. It's about you. They'll want to destroy your name to save theirs." Olivia's face remained unreadable, but her eyes flashed with a familiar fire, the same fierce protectiveness that had kept her daughters safe every day of their lives. She didn't ask why Nicholas was only warning her now. She didn't need to. She knew this was how power worked. But she had never been one to bow her head, not even when the odds were stacked against her. "I'm not afraid of them," Olivia said, her tone steady, though her arms crossed over her chest as if bracing for the battle. "I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being the woman people whisper about but never ask the truth from. If they want a story, I'll give them one." Nicholas hadn't anticipated her defiance, though in retrospect, he should have. She had always been stronger than him when it came to surviving storms. The next day, Olivia made a decision that surprised even Nicholas. She reached out to a journalist. Not one of the vultures who thrived on gossip columns and corporate hit pieces, but a woman named Grace Adams, known for her fearless reporting on corruption and her sharp sense of justice. Grace was reluctant at first. These stories often ended with the victim's voice buried under corporate spin machines. But as Olivia laid out the truth, the pregnancy, the silence, the forced exile from Nicholas's world, Grace realized this wasn't just another scandal. This was a fight against the very structure that silenced women and protected the elite. The interview took place in Olivia's apartment, with the girls napping in the next room. Nicholas was there, but he stayed silent, sitting in the corner, watching Olivia tell her story. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. She spoke with quiet dignity, explaining how she had built a life from nothing while shielding her daughters from a world that considered them inconvenient truths. Grace listened, took notes, asked the hard questions, and promised to print every word unfiltered. When the article was published, it wasn't on the gossip pages but on the front page of a major news outlet. A Woman's Fight Against the Empire, Olivia Hart's story, became a headline that caught fire within hours. The response was immediate. People rallied behind her. Mothers shared their own stories of abandonment and corporate betrayal. Women who had been silenced found in Olivia a symbol of defiance. The internet exploded with support, while the corporate board scrambled to control a narrative that had slipped from their hands. Nicholas watched as Olivia handled the storm with grace, never once stepping out of line, never once lowering herself to their level. He attended meetings where investors demanded accountability, but this time, the tide had shifted. The company couldn't afford to be seen as the villain. The Blake name had been tainted not by Olivia's existence, but by the cruelty of those who tried to erase her. 1 week after the article was published, Nicholas stood beside Olivia as they walked through the park, the girls babbling excitedly in their stroller. People recognized her now. Strangers offered kind words, a mother stopped to thank her for speaking out, an older man gave a respectful nod as he passed. Olivia had become more than a name in an article. She was a symbol of quiet rebellion, a reminder that power did not belong exclusively to those in boardrooms. Nicholas saw the change in her, how she stood taller, how her laughter came easier. He had feared that his world would destroy her, but she had done what he had never dared to do, she had faced it head-on and emerged stronger. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the park, Olivia paused, turning to Nicholas with a look that was softer than it had been in months. "You said you wanted to fight for them," she said, nodding toward the girls. "You're going to get your chance, Nicholas. But this time, you'll do it on my terms." He nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into his bones. There was no room for pride here. No shortcuts to redemption. But standing beside her now, amidst a world that had tried and failed to silence her, Nicholas understood that this battle was far from over. But for the first time, they were no longer fighting alone. The city had changed, or maybe it was Nicholas who had. The streets looked the same, but now every corner carried a memory of the life he had almost lost. The towering offices that once symbolized power now seemed small compared to the quiet strength of Olivia's world. Her story had ignited something far bigger than either of them could have predicted. What started as a single article had rippled through social media, news networks, and public forums. People were no longer whispering about Olivia Hart behind closed doors, they were shouting her name with pride. She had become a symbol of resilience, not because she sought fame, but because she had stood her ground when it would have been easier to disappear. Nicholas spent his days balancing between helping Olivia in small, almost invisible ways, and facing the backlash from his former world. Investors who had once treated him like a golden child now looked at him with a mixture of confusion and reluctant admiration. They couldn't deny the company's stock had stabilized, even risen slightly, ever since Olivia's story broke. It wasn't just sympathy, it was trust. People wanted to believe in something real again. They were tired of polished statements and corporate smiles. Olivia's raw honesty had given them something authentic to rally behind. But Nicholas knew public opinion was fickle. It could change with a single misstep. That was why he treaded carefully. Every appearance in public with Olivia and the girls was deliberate, though never staged. They would go to the park, visit small cafes, always living their lives as they had before, but now under the watchful eyes of a curious public. He didn't mind the attention, not when he saw the way people approached Olivia, not with invasive questions or pity, but with quiet gratitude. Mothers would stop and smile, fathers would nod respectfully, and sometimes, women who had been through their own private wars would share a few words of solidarity. Olivia never basked in the attention, but Nicholas could see how much it meant to her. For once, she was not invisible. The girls were growing fast. Sky had become the leader of the trio, always the first to explore, the first to challenge. Sophie was quieter, more observant, her eyes always scanning, taking in the details. Sadie was the peacemaker, the one who reached out when her sisters clashed over toys or attention. Watching them grow, seeing their personalities unfold, was a daily reminder to Nicholas of everything he had nearly missed. Each moment, each small milestone, felt like a victory. One evening, after a long day filled with interviews and meetings, Nicholas found himself back at Olivia's apartment. It had become a ritual, these evenings. He would arrive after the girls were tucked into bed, and they would sit in the small living room, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, not of conflict, but of something unspoken hovering between them. Olivia sat cross-legged on the couch, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the fabric. Nicholas sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, leaning slightly forward as if the distance between them needed to be physically closed. She looked tired, but not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep. It was a deep weariness, the kind that settled in when you've been fighting for too long. "I've been thinking," Olivia began, her voice steady but softer than usual. "About what comes next. About what this all means now that the world knows." Nicholas listened, sensing this was not just casual reflection. "I don't want them to grow up in a story that's defined by what we've lost," she continued. "I want them to know who they are, where they come from, but not be trapped by the mistakes we've made. They deserve more than that. And I think, maybe, we do too." Nicholas felt his throat tighten. He had rehearsed so many apologies, so many declarations of love in his mind, but none of them seemed worthy in this moment. Instead, he simply nodded, waiting, letting her set the pace. "I see how they look at you now," Olivia said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "They don't know the history, the pain. They just see a man who shows up. Every day. Without fail." "That's all I want to be," Nicholas said quietly. "Someone who shows up. For them. For you." There was a long pause. Olivia's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there, a vulnerability she rarely allowed him to see. "I've built so many walls, Nicholas. I don't know how to let them down without losing myself." He leaned back slightly, giving her space, but his words carried a quiet intensity. "Then don't tear them down. Let me climb them. Let me earn every brick." Her laughter was soft, almost reluctant, but it was the most beautiful sound he had heard all day. For the first time, it felt like the distance between them wasn't so insurmountable. The following week, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. It was a simple afternoon in the park. The girls were playing near a sandbox, Nicholas sitting on the grass a few feet away, Olivia watching from the bench. A young journalist approached, this time with no camera crew, no microphone, just a notebook and a nervous smile. She wasn't there for a scandal or a scoop. She was writing a piece about fathers who fight their way back into their children's lives. She asked if Nicholas would be willing to share his story, not the polished version, but the real one. Nicholas looked at Olivia, silently seeking her permission. She gave a small nod, her eyes reflecting an understanding that this was no longer just their private battle. It had become something larger, a narrative that could reshape how the world viewed redemption, parenthood, and second chances. The article was published under the headline, "The Father Who Refused to Disappear." It wasn't sensationalized. It spoke of his failures, his cowardice, but also of his persistence, his quiet acts of showing up every day for the daughters who had no reason to trust him. The public response was overwhelming, but this time, it wasn't filled with scandal-chasing whispers. It was filled with letters from parents, from children, from people who had longed for reconciliation but never found the path. Nicholas realized then that the past didn't need to define them, not if they were willing to rewrite the ending. And Olivia, who had fought so fiercely to protect her daughters from the world's cruelty, was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the wreckage. One evening, as they were packing up after a day at the park, Skye reached out, grabbing Nicholas's hand without prompting. She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and trusting, and simply said, "Daddy." The word was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed louder than any applause Nicholas had ever received in his life. He turned to Olivia, his heart in his throat, but she was already watching him, her lips curved in a smile that was no longer guarded. In that moment, Nicholas understood that forgiveness wasn't a grand gesture. It was in the quiet moments, in the way a 2-year-old's hand could bridge 2 years of silence, in the way Olivia no longer looked through him, but at him. He didn't need her to say the words. He could see it in her eyes. The walls weren't gone, but there was a door now. And for the first time, she was standing there, holding it open. The air was warm with the promise of summer, and the city felt softer that evening, as though even its sharp edges had been dulled by the quiet anticipation that hummed beneath the surface. Nicholas had planned every detail meticulously, not in the grand, over-orchestrated way he once might have, but with a carefulness born of humility. He knew Olivia didn't care for lavish displays or empty gestures. She valued sincerity, and he intended to give her nothing less. The park had always been their place. It was where he had first dared to follow her, where his daughters had unknowingly offered him their acceptance in the form of simple smiles and outstretched hands. It was fitting that it would become the setting for what Nicholas hoped would be the beginning of their next chapter. He arrived early, setting up a quiet picnic beneath the large oak tree that had shaded them on so many afternoons. There were no photographers hiding in bushes, no elaborate decorations. Just a soft blanket, a basket filled with Olivia's favorite foods, and a small box tucked safely in his pocket. The girls were in on the secret, as much as 2-year-olds could be. He had spent the previous evening with them, crafting 3 small gold heart pendants, each engraved with their names, Skye, Sophie, Sadie. They had giggled as he explained their special mission, though he wasn't entirely sure how much of it they understood. But that didn't matter. Their presence was enough. When Olivia arrived, pushing the stroller with a practiced grace, she looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious amusement. The girls were restless, squirming in their seats, eager to be free. Nicholas stood and approached them, his heart pounding with a nervousness that had nothing to do with fear of rejection, but everything to do with the significance of the moment. "This looks dangerously close to a date, Nicholas," Olivia said, her lips twitching into a smile that was no longer weighed down by skepticism. "Maybe it is," he replied, lifting Sophie out of the stroller and settling her onto the blanket. "But it's not the kind you're thinking of." Olivia raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she began unpacking the basket with him. The girls tumbled onto the grass, their laughter filling the air, oblivious to the tension slowly building in Nicholas's chest. He waited, letting the evening unfold with ease, not rushing, not forcing the moment. They ate, they talked, and for a while, it felt like any other evening they had shared. But beneath his calm exterior, Nicholas's fingers fidgeted with the small box in his pocket, the words he had rehearsed over and over circling through his mind. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the park in hues of gold and amber. Nicholas knew it was time. He reached into the basket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. The girls, sensing that something was happening, gathered around him with wide, expectant eyes. He handed them each one of the pendants, their tiny fingers clutching the delicate chains with excitement. "Girls," he began, his voice steady despite the storm within him, "I need your help. Do you think you can give these to Mommy for me?" Sky, always the leader, nodded with a serious expression, as if she understood the gravity of her task. Sophie followed, her lips curved into a shy smile, while Sadie, ever the peacemaker, clapped her hands in approval. Together, they toddled toward Olivia, who watched them with a puzzled expression, her eyes narrowing as they presented her with the pendants. She took them, her fingers brushing over the engraved names, her lips parting slightly in surprise. Nicholas rose, his heart hammering against his ribs, and crossed the space between them. He knelt in front of her, not out of tradition, but because it felt right. Because Olivia Hart had carried more weight in the past 2 years than he had ever known, and she deserved more than a man standing over her with a question. "I know this isn't the life you imagined," he said, his voice raw and exposed. "And I know I'm not the man I was supposed to be. But every day with you and with them, I've learned what it means to show up. Not with promises or grand gestures, but with quiet persistence. I don't want to be a visitor in this life we've built together, Olivia. I want to be home." He reached into his pocket and retrieved the box, opening it to reveal a simple ring, no extravagant diamonds, no ostentatious flair. Just a band, crafted with care, inscribed with a phrase only she would understand, "All three, always." Olivia's breath caught. She looked at him, at the ring, at their daughters who now sat watching, mimicking their father by kneeling in the grass, giggling at their own private joke. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming truth that this man before her had changed, not for the world, but for them. Nicholas didn't push. He let the silence hang, understanding that Olivia's answer was never going to be given lightly. But then, as if the walls she had so carefully built had quietly crumbled without either of them noticing, she smiled. It was a smile that carried every battle scar, every sleepless night, every whispered promise she had made to her daughters in the dark. And in that moment, Nicholas knew her answer before she even spoke. "Yes," Olivia said softly, reaching out to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as naturally as if they had always been meant to. "But not because of the ring. Because of you. Because of them. Because we've already built the life that matters." The girls squealed in delight, unaware of the magnitude of what had just transpired, but their laughter was the perfect soundtrack to the moment. Nicholas slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of what it symbolized. Olivia leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to simply breathe in the same space, without the ghosts of their past standing between them. As the sun finally dipped below the skyline, casting the park in soft twilight, Nicholas realized something profound. Proposals were not about perfection or spectacle. They were about timing, about showing up, about understanding that love was forged in the quiet moments of shared struggle. And in that evening, surrounded by the sounds of their daughters' laughter, Nicholas Blake knew that he had found everything he had been searching for, not in boardrooms or business deals, but in the small, beautiful world that Olivia had created against all odds. They sat together on the blanket, Olivia's head resting on his shoulder, the girls nestled between them, and for the first time in years, Nicholas felt what it was like to be whole. The past was still there, but it no longer defined them. The future was uncertain, but it no longer terrified him. And the present, with its imperfect, chaotic beauty, was exactly where he wanted to be.
Rain trickled down the glass windows, leaving streaks like ink bleeding through paper. The pale morning light pushed through the overcast sky, casting a soft glow inside Heavenly Bites, a small bakery nestled on a quiet street. Emma Carter flipped the open sign with a quiet sigh. The familiar chime of the brass doorbell rang out, a comforting yet bittersweet sound. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing smudges of flour on her forearms. The rich scent of vanilla, butter, and cinnamon filled the air, wrapping the space in warmth. But it did little to ease the weight pressing against her chest. A single envelope sat on the counter, a final notice from the bank. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. 1 more month. That was all she had left before everything slipped through her fingers. Taking a deep breath, Emma folded the letter and tucked it away in the drawer. She couldn't afford to dwell on it now. Instead, she reached for a worn-out notebook from the shelf, her grandmother's recipe book. The pages were yellowed, edges curled from years of use, each handwritten note a reminder of a legacy she was fighting to protect. She set to work, kneading the dough with rhythmic precision. Baking had always been her sanctuary, the act itself a silent promise that as long as she could create something beautiful, there was still hope. Outside, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the bakery, its tinted windows concealing the man inside. Emma had no idea that a storm was about to enter her life. The bakery door swung open, the soft chime of the brass bell signaling an arrival. Emma glanced up from the register and immediately froze. A man stood at the entrance, dressed in a sleek black suit, his dark brown hair perfectly styled, piercing blue eyes, scanning the room with quiet authority. He wasn't a customer. Alexander Hayes. Emma recognized the name instantly, CEO of Hayes Enterprises, the man who turned old neighborhoods into luxury developments, erasing small businesses like hers in the process. She clenched the napkin in her hand, forcing herself to stay composed. "Good morning, Miss Carter." His deep voice carried an air of absolute confidence. "If you're here to buy my bakery, don't waste your time," Emma shot back, crossing her arms. "I'm not here to buy," Alexander smirked, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crisp white envelope. "I'm here to make you an offer." Emma eyed the envelope warily as he set it down on the counter between them. 6 months, Alexander said smoothly. "You accompany me to events, dinners, press appearances. In return, I'll ensure you keep this bakery." Emma let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Are you serious? What kind of woman do you think I am?" "This is a business arrangement, no personal conditions," Alexander interrupted, his tone measured. "Think of it as a strategic partnership. I need a reliable public image, and you need the financial backing to keep your bakery. It's mutually beneficial." Emma's instinct was to reject him immediately. She wasn't some accessory to be bought. But then her gaze flickered toward the drawer, where the bank's foreclosure notice still sat. Slowly, hesitantly, she picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The numbers inside stole her breath away. It was enough to not only pay off her debts but expand the bakery. Alexander watched her, his gaze unreadable yet patient. "You have 24 hours to decide," he said, sliding a business card toward her before turning to leave. The door closed behind him, leaving Emma standing in the middle of her bakery, an envelope in her hands and chaos in her heart. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow over the grand ballroom. Elegant gowns swished against polished marble floors, the air thick with murmured conversations and the delicate clinking of champagne glasses. Emma Carter stood among it all, feeling completely out of place. The deep burgundy silk dress fit her perfectly. The high heels gave her extra confidence and stature, but nothing could ease the unease twisting in her stomach. Beside her, Alexander Hayes exuded effortless charm, clad in a tailored black tuxedo, his presence commanding yet composed. A glass of wine in one hand, his other rested lightly on the small of her back, a subtle but unmistakable mark of possession. He had brought her here as part of their agreement, to show the world that he was no longer just a ruthless businessman, but a man with a genuine connection. "Relax, Emma," Alexander murmured, his lips barely brushing her ear. "Just smile and pretend you're enjoying yourself." Emma tightened her grip around the delicate stem of her champagne flute, forcing herself to comply. She felt the weight of curious glances, silent assessments from guests who measured her against an invisible scale. She wasn't part of their world, and they all knew it, but she had agreed to this deal, and she had to play her part convincingly. A middle-aged woman approached, diamonds glittering at her throat, recognition flashing in Emma's mind. A major real estate investor. "Alexander," the woman drawled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "How refreshing to see you with someone new." Emma barely had time to formulate a response before Alexander's hand at her waist pulled her closer. "This is Emma Carter, owner of Heavenly Bites. She's an incredible talent and a woman with a vision." The words should have meant nothing. After all, this was just an act. But something about the way he said them stirred a strange warmth in her chest. The evening ended with them sliding into the back seat of a sleek black car. Silence stretched between them, the hum of the city filling the air. Emma stared out the window, watching reflections of neon lights dance across the glass. This arrangement was supposed to be a safe path, a means to an end. But where exactly was it leading her? It was late. But inside Heavenly Bites, the warm glow of the kitchen lights still illuminated trays of freshly baked pastries, filling the air with the scent of butter and vanilla. Emma Carter moved with effortless precision, kneading dough with practiced hands. The rhythmic sound of her whisk blending ingredients was like a familiar melody, soothing in its simplicity. She loved these moments, alone with her flour, sugar, and her grandmother's recipes. Here, there were no business deals, no scrutinizing gazes, just her and her craft. The kitchen door creaked open, snapping her out of her thoughts. She turned around, startled to see Alexander Hayes standing there, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened. He looked tired, but there was something in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked, masking her surprise. Alexander stepped further inside, leaning against the counter like he belonged there. "I was driving past and saw the lights on. Figured you'd still be working." Emma arched a brow. "Since when do you care about my schedule?" Alexander smirked, his eyes drifting to the flour dusted across her arms. "I suppose I'm curious. You spend all your time here, alone with these recipes. What is it about baking that keeps you coming back?" Emma hesitated for a moment, then reached for a lavender honey tart from a cooling tray, placing it on a plate in front of him. "Taste and find out." He studied her for a moment before picking up the pastry, taking a bite. As soon as the flavors hit his tongue, his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The crispness of the crust, the smoothness of the honey-infused filling, and the delicate floral notes of lavender all melded together perfectly. "This is..." He swallowed slowly, as if savoring every last hint of flavor. "Incredible." Emma met his gaze, and for the first time, he wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing her. "Now you understand," she said softly, a small smile playing at her lips. Alexander didn't respond right away, but when he finally set the plate down, the look in his eyes said everything. The golden hues of sunset bathed the streets as Emma Carter locked up Heavenly Bites for the night. The last rays of light danced on the shop's windows, reflecting her image. Tired, yet undeniably filled with a warmth she couldn't quite explain. She couldn't pinpoint when Alexander Hayes had become a part of her daily life. At first, he had been nothing more than a distant figure, a business partner in an agreement she had reluctantly entered. But somewhere along the way, his presence had stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling natural. Like now, working this late again? Emma turned at the sound of his voice, finding Alexander leaning casually against his car. His sharp blue eyes held something softer tonight, and without his usual crisp composure, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, he looked almost approachable. "The bakery doesn't run itself," she replied, attempting a neutral tone, but the way his gaze lingered on her made her stomach tighten. Alexander stepped forward, pressing a warm paper cup into her hands. "Chamomile honey tea. Thought you might need it." Emma blinked in surprise, staring at the cup before looking up at him. "You remembered I like this?" He shrugged, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I pay attention." Her heart skipped. He didn't have to do this. But he did. They walked down the quiet street in companionable silence, their footsteps the only sound against the evening breeze. Emma realized something. Being beside Alexander, silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. "Have you ever thought about expanding the bakery?" he asked suddenly. Emma chuckled. "I'm barely keeping it afloat, and you think I can expand?" Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her. "I think you can do anything if you want to." She swallowed hard. He had said it with such certainty she wanted to believe him. Emma didn't know what was happening between them, but she knew one thing. Something was changing. The rain pounded against the city like a relentless drumbeat, echoing off the glass roof of Heavenly Bites. Inside, Emma Carter sat hunched over her laptop, her breath caught in her throat as her eyes scanned the words flashing across the screen. Hayes Enterprises unveils plans for urban redevelopment to small businesses to be replaced by luxury commercial complex. The images on the screen blurred as hot tears welled in her eyes. There it was, her entire street, her beloved bakery, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in a corporate expansion plan. The place she had fought so hard to keep alive was now just a casualty of progress. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her phone, dialing Alexander's number, straight to voicemail, again and again. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. This wasn't happening. He had promised her. He had stood in her bakery, watched her pour her heart into every pastry, every recipe. Had all of it been a lie? Emma's breath came in short gasps. All of Alexander's words, the quiet reassurances, the warm glances, the late nights where he listened to her talk about her dreams. Were they all just lies? Her hands clenched into fists, rage building in her chest. She had trusted him. She had let herself believe that beneath his sharp, calculating exterior, there was something real. But in the end, he was exactly who she feared he was. She ripped the contract in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground before grabbing her coat and storming out into the rain. The doors to Alexander Hayes' office burst open with a force that silenced the entire boardroom. Every executive turned, startled by the sight of Emma, drenched from the storm, her eyes burning with fury. Alexander was already on his feet, surprise flashing across his face. "Emma!" Before he could say another word, she slammed a printed copy of the article onto the table in front of him. "When exactly were you planning to tell me?" Her voice trembled with barely contained anger. "After I had completely trusted you?" Alexander glanced at the paper, his jaw tightening. "Emma, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" She let out a bitter laugh. "You told me this arrangement was just for show. You told me you weren't trying to destroy my bakery, and yet here we are. Tell me, was I just a fool in your grand plan?" He took a step toward her, but she instinctively stepped back. She didn't believe the softness in his eyes anymore. "Let me explain," he said, his voice lower now, tinged with something dangerously close to desperation. But Emma was too hurt to listen. She turned on her heel, walking away from the man she had started to believe in, leaving behind shattered trust and a dream that was now nothing more than rubble. The sky hung heavy over the city, a dull gray curtain mirroring the storm inside Emma Carter. She walked along the familiar streets, where the scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries lingered in the crisp autumn air. But today, the warmth she once felt was gone. After everything that happened with Alexander Hayes, she felt drained. Heavenly Bites stood on the edge of ruin. Customers still came, but the whispers of demolition cast a shadow over the bakery. They loved her, but they feared the inevitable. How long before the bakery was nothing more than a memory? Emma stopped in front of her shop and immediately noticed something unusual. A basket of fresh lavender sat at her doorstep, a small note tucked beneath it. "I'm sorry, please meet me, Alexander." She gripped the note tightly, torn between anger and uncertainty. What was there left to say? More lies? Yet somehow, despite everything, her feet carried her toward the meeting place. A small rooftop garden atop an old building, once home to a famed restaurant that had long since closed. Alexander was already there, his sharp blue eyes holding something she had never seen before: regret. When he saw her, a visible tension left his shoulders. "Emma, thank you for coming." She crossed her arms, her voice cool. You have 5 minutes. For a moment, Alexander hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he handed her a folder. This is the new contract. I bought back the development rights to the district. Emma flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the terms. The project had changed. No demolitions, no luxury complexes. Instead, the entire area would be transformed into a cultural and culinary hub, preserving small businesses. She looked up at him, suspicion still in her gaze. Why are you doing this? Alexander exhaled slowly before saying, Because you made me see the world differently, and I can't lose you. Something inside Emma shifted. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again, but at least this wasn't a game anymore. Emma stood on the rooftop of the old building, the folder in her hands feeling heavier than anything she had ever held before. Inside it was everything she had ever wanted, a chance to save her bakery, to protect her neighborhood. But it wasn't just that. She looked at Alexander Hayes, the man who had once embodied everything she despised. Cold ambition, ruthless decisions, a detachment from anything that didn't serve his interests. But now he stood before her, not as a conqueror, but as a man risking everything. You didn't do this just for the neighborhood, she said slowly, searching his sharp blue eyes for the truth. Alexander let out a quiet laugh, but there was no mockery in it. No, I did this for you. Her heart clenched. She wanted to believe him, but fear still lingered. How do I know you won't change again? He stepped closer, the space between them vanishing. You don't, but I'm willing to spend forever proving it to you. Emma took a deep breath. She had fought her feelings for weeks, convincing herself that this was just a business deal, that she felt nothing for him. But every glance, every moment they shared, it had all been real. She tightened her grip on the folder, then slowly nodded. Okay. Alexander's brows furrowed. Okay? Emma looked up at him, determination shining in her gaze. I believe you. And before logic could stop her, she rose on her toes, pulling him into a kiss. Not a bargain, not an agreement, but a promise. 1 month later, the golden hues of sunset draped over the city like powdered sugar on a freshly baked pastry. Heavenly Bites was closing for the evening, and Emma Carter wiped down the counter while sneaking a glance outside. Alexander Hayes stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze distant, as if deep in thought. He had changed. Gone was the ruthless businessman who once saw the world in numbers and deals. He had proven himself to the neighborhood, to her dreams, and maybe to her heart. Stepping outside, she pulled her coat tighter as a cool breeze passed. What are you doing here? Alexander turned, a small smile tugging at his lips. Waiting for you. Before she could question him, he took her hand, leading her down the softly lit streets. They passed bustling cafes, twinkling lanterns overhead, and shop owners laughing as they closed for the night. Not a soulless corporate development, but a thriving, living community. At last, he brought her to the rooftop garden, where they had once spoken of impossible choices. But tonight, something was different. Tiny string lights hung across the space, a small table set for two, with wine and pastries. Her heart began to race. Alexander turned to her, his deep blue eyes reflecting the night sky. Emma, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I used to think success was everything, that life was about numbers and contracts. But then you came along, with flour on your hands, with a smile that made me forget everything else, with pastries that carried pieces of your soul. She held her breath as he dropped to one knee, a small velvet box in his hands. I've spent my life chasing the wrong things, but this time I know for certain. I don't want a contract, I want a promise. With you. Forever. He opened the box, revealing a ring. Simple, timeless, perfect, just like them. Emma Carter, will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes. This time, she didn't hesitate. She smiled, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes. As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Emma knew this wasn't just a love story. This was their beginning. Eleanor Sinclair had spent her entire life inside a gilded cage, a place where everything was flawless, yet she was shackled by the invisible chains of duty and purity. As the only daughter of Senator Alexander Sinclair, she had been raised to be a perfect lady, a pristine pearl, carefully preserved until the day she would become a bargaining chip in a marriage of power and advantage. At 23, Eleanor had never been kissed, never felt the warmth of a lover's touch, never even dreamed of freedom. Her life had been meticulously planned, every step dictated by her father's ambitions, and she had always obeyed. Until that day. Senator Sinclair entered her room, his face pale, his eyes heavy with dread. "You're getting married, Eleanor. We have no choice." Her stomach twisted. Married? She looked at her father, waiting for an explanation, but deep down she already knew. His political empire had crumbled, his reputation lay in ruins, and now she was the last asset he could trade. The man he had chosen for her was not a noble gentleman nor a stranger, but Leon Hawthorne, a ruthless businessman, a man who could make the world bow at his feet with power and wealth. And in that moment, Eleanor knew her life would never be her own again. Eleanor sat motionless, her wide eyes staring ahead, yet inside she felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. Her father's words echoed in her mind, each syllable carving cold, merciless cuts into her soul. Marriage. She should have fought back, should have screamed, should have begged her father not to do this. But his eyes, heavy with defeat, told her everything. This was not a choice. This was a sentence already written. Her father had lost everything. His political allies had turned their backs, his name was tainted, and debts loomed over him like a guillotine. He needed a way out, and that way out was her. Leon Hawthorne has agreed. His voice was hollow, as if even he couldn't believe the words he was saying. Eleanor had heard of the man. A dangerous man, someone who possessed the very things the world craved: money, power, and merciless ambition. Leon Hawthorne was no charming aristocrat. He was a businessman, a predator in the corporate world, a man who never took no for an answer, a man feared even by those who ruled the country. She had seen him once, on the cover of a financial magazine. Dark, piercing eyes, a sharp, commanding face. A man who didn't just own companies, he owned people as if they were commodities to be traded. And now she was the commodity. "The wedding is set for this weekend," her father murmured, avoiding her gaze. A wedding, a transaction, a contract signed in cold black ink. And in just a few days, Eleanor Sinclair would cease to exist. She would become Mrs. Leon Hawthorne. Eleanor's wedding felt like a sentence being passed down. There were no flowers, no laughter, no heartfelt blessings, only a cold transaction signed between two men, one desperate and one in control. She wore a dress she did not choose, spoke vows she did not believe, and signed her name on a piece of paper that sealed her fate forever. There was no celebration, no honeymoon, only a sleek black car waiting to take her away, straight to Leon Hawthorne's estate. The towering structure of glass and stone loomed under the night sky, as cold and unyielding as the man waiting for her inside. The door shut behind her. The driver led her to the master bedroom, a vast, dark space where the bed stood like an altar for sacrifice. Her breath hitched as she heard the door open behind her. Leon Hawthorne stepped inside, shrugging off his jacket, loosening his tie. His gaze was dark, intense, trailing down her form, quiet possession flashing behind those steel-like eyes. "Did you really think you'd sleep alone tonight?" His voice was low, edged with danger, cutting through the silence like a blade. Eleanor instinctively stepped back, but her spine met the cold, unyielding wall. Leon moved forward, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. "You're my wife, Eleanor." His head tilted slightly, eyes sharp and calculating. "And I always take what's mine." Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs. There was no escape. And tonight, this beast would take the last piece of her she had left. Morning light seeped through the thick curtains, casting a soft glow over Eleanor's bare skin. She lay motionless among the tangled sheets, her body exhausted, aching, but what unsettled her most was the emptiness settling deep inside her. The remnants of last night clung to her, his scent on her skin, his warmth lingering on the pillow, the ghost of his hands tracing every inch of her body. Leon Hawthorne was no longer there, yet he was everywhere. His presence filled the room like an invisible chain wrapping around her. Eleanor clutched the sheets closer, trying to still the tremors running through her. She should hate him, she should despise him. But what terrified her most was herself. She hadn't fought him, she hadn't pushed him away, and worst of all, she had responded. The door swung open. Leon entered, his hair damp from a shower, the crisp black shirt hanging open at the top, exposing the hard lines of his chest. His gaze found hers, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, as if he could read every thought racing through her mind. "Did you sleep well?" His voice was low, teasing. Eleanor gripped the sheets tighter. "You forced me." Leon chuckled, a dark, knowing sound. He moved closer, slow, deliberate, watching her the way a predator watches its prey. "Forced?" he repeated, leaning down, his face now just inches from hers. "Don't lie to me, Eleanor. You moaned under me, welcomed me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "More than once." Her breath hitched. She wanted to deny it, wanted to push him away. But the most terrifying truth of all was that she couldn't. The days that followed passed in a reality Eleanor had never imagined. Leon was not just the man who had taken her on their wedding night, but also the man who surrounded her with a terrifying kind of tenderness. He never let her out of his reach, not as a tyrant, but as a man who was afraid of losing the woman he loved. His touch was no longer about possession, but something far more dangerous, as if without her, he wouldn't know how to breathe. His arms pulled her close every night, holding her as if she was the only thing anchoring him to this world. And Eleanor could no longer deny that she felt it too. It was in the way he placed a cup of tea exactly the way she liked it every morning. Every morning, when she woke, breakfast was already waiting, not prepared by the servants, but by his own hands. A cup of tea, brewed just the way she liked, toast perfectly crisp, fruit sliced with meticulous care, as if he had memorized her preferences long ago. "You made this yourself?" she asked one morning, surprised as she stared at the plate in front of her. Leon simply shrugged, pride flickering in his dark eyes. "You're my wife. Who else would take better care of you?" He never needed to say, "I love you," because it was there in every gesture. When she walked through the garden, he watched from a distance, always ready to shield her when the wind picked up. When she was tired, he pulled her into his lap, massaging her feet, pressing a silent kiss against her forehead. Eleanor had once thought Leon only knew how to take, but the night she fell ill, he stayed awake beside her, pressing cool cloths to her burning skin, holding her as if her smallest pain could destroy him. She should hate him, she should want to run. But as she lay in his arms during the long nights, Eleanor knew there was no going back. Leon Hawthorne had claimed her body that first night. But the most terrifying thing of all was that he was slowly claiming her heart as well. That morning, Eleanor had barely taken a sip of her tea when the dining room doors swung open. The butler entered, his face grave. "Sir, there's a call. Your lawyer says it's urgent." Leon set his coffee down, eyes darkening as he reached for the phone. Eleanor could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. She couldn't hear the full conversation, but the clipped words she caught sent a chill through her. "What the hell is he doing?" His voice turned sharp. "No, absolutely not." When the call ended, he tossed the phone onto the table, his expression unreadable. "Your father wants you back." Eleanor froze. "Isn't our contract enough to keep me here?" Her voice was quiet, but the worry was evident. Leon let out a cold laugh. "Sinclair thinks he can use lawyers to take you from me. He forgets. You're not his anymore." Before she could respond, he stood and pulled her with him. "We're going to see him, now." The glass skyscraper where her father waited loomed over them, imposing and sterile. Inside the boardroom, Senator Alexander St. Clair rose to his feet the moment they entered. He looked thinner than before, but his gaze was still sharp, still commanding. "Eleanor, you don't have to endure this. Come home with me." Leon's grip on her waist tightened, his voice cold as steel. "She's not going anywhere." Her father met Leon's gaze head on. "This contract can be undone. I will fight until it is." Leon only smirked, tugging Eleanor closer. "She's not some possession for you to reclaim." Then he bent down, murmuring into her ear, "Tell him, Eleanor." She took a deep breath. Under her father's expectant stare, she spoke slowly but firmly. "Enough." Both men turned to look at her, but she didn't meet their eyes. She focused only on her own breathing, her own decision. She turned to her father, her voice calm but firm. "You can't use me as a trade anymore." Then she faced Leon, pain flickering in her gaze but no longer fear. "And neither can you." Silence filled the room. Eleanor turned away, stepping toward the door. No one stopped her. And for the first time in a long while, she felt free. Leon had searched everywhere. He knew Eleanor couldn't have gone too far. Then he remembered. One evening, she had once told him about a place she always went when she felt lost. A lavender field just outside the city. When he arrived, the world felt different. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the lavender field in a surreal glow, but his eyes found only her. Standing there, lost in thought, the breeze lifting strands of her hair, Eleanor looked almost untouchable. Like a dream he was afraid to wake from. She was still, her gaze lost in the horizon. The wind played with her hair, and in that moment, Leon realized she had never looked more breathtaking. He stepped closer but said nothing. Eleanor knew he was there. She didn't turn around, only murmured, "Why did you come looking for me?" Leon exhaled. "Because you're not a transaction, Eleanor." His voice was low, unsteady. "You are the one thing I can't afford to lose." She let out a soft chuckle, not mocking but thoughtful. She finally turned to face him, her eyes holding a gentleness he had never seen before. "Then prove it, Leon." Leon drove Eleanor home in silence. The entire way back, she said nothing, only gazing out the window, as if still lost in the scent of lavender. He didn't push her to speak. He was afraid that if he did, she would slip away again. When the car stopped in front of the estate, Eleanor stepped out, but instead of heading inside, she hesitated at the entrance. "Do you think bringing me back means you get to keep me?" Her voice was soft, almost distant. Leon's fists clenched. He knew that if he didn't act now, he would lose her. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees right there, on the doorstep of their home. At her feet. Eleanor froze. "Don't leave." His voice was low, raw with desperation. "I don't know how to love you the way you deserve, but I know I can't exist without you." The man who had always stood above everyone else, the man who had never bowed to anyone, was now on his knees before her, as if losing her meant losing everything. Eleanor looked down at him, meeting his pleading gaze, but she didn't answer right away. She had once been controlled, once been forced to stay, but this time she wanted him to understand that love was not about possession. She knelt down beside him, her fingers brushing against his face, her voice gentle but firm. "If you truly want me, Leon, then prove it. Not with words, not with possession, but with the way you choose to love me." As she spoke, something inside her shifted. She had spent so long fearing him, fighting him, but now, for the first time, she saw a man, not a monster. A man trembling at the edge of losing her. The next morning, the estate gates swung open and a fleet of black cars pulled into the driveway. Her father's lawyers had arrived. Eleanor stood by the window, watching as they stepped out, men in dark suits carrying documents, symbols of her father's power. Leon stood beside her, his body tense, his gaze dark and unreadable. "He really thinks he can take you from me?" His voice was low, dangerously cold. Eleanor said nothing. Instead, she gently placed her hand on his arm, a silent reassurance. Then she stepped outside. Her father's lawyers were waiting, stiff and formal. "Eleanor, come with us. This contract can be undone. Your father has arranged everything to bring you home." She looked at them, then back at Leon, the man who had once forced her into his world, yet now stood waiting, uncertain, afraid. Eleanor took a slow, deep breath before stepping beside Leon. She met the lawyer's eyes, her voice calm, yet resolute. "I choose to stay." Silence. The lawyers exchanged glances, then turned and left without another word. The estate gates closed behind them. Leon didn't wait. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, kissing her, not like a man claiming possession, but like a man who had fallen irrevocably in love. They were no longer hunter and prey. They were two souls melting into each other with a love that was finally real. 1 month later, Eleanor was sitting in the small garden behind the estate when a car pulled up at the gate. She lifted her head, her heart tightening as she saw her father step out. He looked older. His hair had more gray. His eyes no longer held the pride they once did. Instead, there was only deep regret. She stood, waiting as he approached. "Eleanor," his voice wavered, "I was wrong." She didn't speak, allowing him to continue. "I treated you like a pawn. I forced you into this marriage without thinking about your happiness. But do you know," he took a shaky breath, "for the past month, I've wondered if I even deserve to call myself your father anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, but she simply smiled and stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. "You will always be my father," she whispered, "and you didn't condemn me to misery. I found someone who cherishes me, who loves me in ways I never expected." For a moment, Senator Sinclair stiffened. Then, slowly, he embraced his daughter for the first time in years. From that day on, things got better. Eleanor and Leon lived in a world filled with love. Leon worshiping her with the kind of devotion she had once feared, now embraced. 3 years later, the lavender fields stretched endlessly under the golden hues of the setting sun. Eleanor stood there, her hand intertwined with Leon's, both watching as two small figures ran through the sea of flowers. Their twin children, a boy and a girl, giggled as they chased butterflies, their laughter ringing like the sweetest melody. Eleanor leaned her head against Leon's shoulder, feeling his arms tighten protectively around her. "Are you happy?" he murmured. She smiled, her gaze still locked on their children. "I've never been happier." The soft breeze carried the scent of lavender, mingling with the laughter of their little ones. From an unwanted marriage, from a relationship once built on obsession and control, they had found something real, love, unwavering and true. And this was the happiest ending they could have ever wished for.